Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you for facilitating this, Dr. Slaughterback, and thank you to all the other presenters. My name is Dalton Fox. I just wrapped up my Master's of Public Admin at Boise State University. And in addition to my program, I've also been working with Dr. Stephanie Lenhart, who I think is on call right now, over the past year and a half on some research that investigated these entities known as regional transmission organizations. She and I worked together on 3 different pieces, and today I'm going to be talking to you about our third piece, which aimed to illuminate and highlight the perspectives of the members who navigate the processes happening within these transmission organizations and analyzing their perspectives. Uh-oh. My slide advancing is not, okay, there we go. So to start, I thought I would provide some background on what regional transmission organizations are, because I found that a lot of people, even within the energy and environmental landscapes, are still kind of unsure. And so for some brief background, basically in the 1990s, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, called upon different power pools and different markets to create these regional transmission organizations, or RTOs, as a way to kind of manage and facilitate transmission of electricity in different sectors of the nation. And so this map that I have here on our slides shows where the different regional transmission organizations are located. Within the US, there are 7 total, and there are 6 that follow under these FERC jurisdictions, and those are California ISO, Southwest Power Pool, Mid-Continent ISO, New York ISO, ISO New England, the PJM interconnection, and then there's also the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, but they're non-FERC jurisdictional, they're an independent RTO. But essentially the operational responsibilities of these organizations is to manage and monitor the electricity market within their jurisdictions and to schedule and plan generation and transmission accordingly, and ultimately to dispatch the generated electricity as is appropriate to meet the market demand. And to do so, they're supposed, and to make these decisions about transmission scheduling and planning, they are supposed to do so in alignment with these FERC principles that I've outlined below, which are inclusiveness of all stakeholders who may be affected by business practices, a fair balancing of diverse interests, which specifically includes facilitating deliberation and avoiding dominance from any one faction of stakeholder, which for example could be like transmission line owners or generating entities. They need to allow for the representation of minority positions on electricity policy issues, and they need to demonstrate ongoing responsiveness to stakeholders in these decision-making processes. And then finally, they're also supposed to be acting as a completely independent authority from market participants, again, going into that non-domination of market participants in these processes. And so this is more of the nuts and bolts and numbers of it. This is just to this table is just to demonstrate that there's variance in the size and capacity of these RTOs. As you can see, some of them, like New York and California, are single state RTOs. They only serve within their state. But the other 4 go across state boundaries and serve between 7 and 12 states. And what I think is interesting about this table is that when you tally up the total number of millions of people served, we hit about 188 million people that are having their electricity needs met through these RTOs. And this kind of nicely leads me into the motivation for this research. In addition to just 188 million people being served, these RTOs manage 70% of the bulk electricity supply in the United States. And because of their scale and magnitude, this means that the policy decisions that they're making in these organizations play really substantial roles in things like cost, distribution, and overall sustainability of the US's energy infrastructure. And we also think that this research is interesting because of recent events. What we saw happening in Texas with their winter storms that were causing blackouts, as well as some really interesting decisions made by ERCOT, such as having some consumers face bills of upwards of $10,000 for their monthly electricity charges. So that just goes to show that the decisions not only are important on a broad scale, but can be really impactful for individual citizens. Other motivating factors include the principles outlined by FERC, and FERC's practices as well really indicate that these RTOs are meant to represent the public's interests. Again, they need to be inclusive of all stakeholders affected by business practices, and they need to represent minority positions. And their overseeing organization, FERC, has actually just recently opened an Office of Public Participation. So all of this just goes to show that these organizations are meant to be serving the public, are meant to be serving citizens. Yet, as I will get into, we're not sure if they're always entirely operating for the benefit of the public. So to understand the research, I want to go over the very basics. This is the RTO light of the form and function, because each RTO is unique and has differences in structure and operation. But typically, there are these three main categories that exist within RTOs that intermingle in these decision-making processes. At the top, we have the RTO board. This is a group of people who has that independent authority to propose market changes and energy policy. And this is done through something called a tariff change proposal. Basically, these RTOs operate in accordance to a tariff that outlines market rules and current policy. And if they want to change that, they have to propose these changes to FERC, and FERC will either allow or not allow these changes to be made. And underneath the board, we have the senior standing committee. So what happens before the board actually creates a tariff change and proposes it to FERC is that they present it to this senior standing committee. And this committee and the board has some sort of amount of iterations between the initial proposal, comment and feedback from these formal stakeholder members, potential alterations made by the board. And after a few iterations of that, this formal stakeholder board will cast a vote that will indicate whether or not as a whole they are in favor or against the tariff change, which the board will take into consideration when they are filing at FERC. And then additionally, we have lower committees that are, they usually focus on specific and niche issues. So there might be a task force on GHG emissions or a working group on cost efficiency. They work on specific and one-off issue areas. They'll maybe conduct research, and they usually provide information for the board and the senior standing committee to use during these decision-making processes. And so that leads me into our research questions. Because these RTOs have such a huge stake in our electricity infrastructure, and they are kind of operated through the stakeholder-driven decision-making process for market changes and policy implementation, we wanted to know how those people within the senior standing committee, how those members themselves view their ability to effectively engage in these decision-making processes. We want to know what opportunities they feel exist for open dialogue and learning. And we wanted to know how they feel they are allocating their resources to different types of venues to make decisions. And additionally, we asked some questions about how COVID might be impacting all of these processes as well. And so we founded this on literature that just goes to show the importance of understanding stakeholder communication and collaboration. Although it kind of seems intuitive that that is the case, we obviously wanted to go ahead and demonstrate that the literature does show that the effect or the ability of stakeholders to openly communicate not only affects organizational resiliency, but also an organization's efficiency, and that the structure of organizations and how stakeholders collaborate are co-responsive, meaning that they can both impact the shape and structure of each other. And then finally, because these FERC principles outline that the facilitation of deliberation needs to be had, we wanted to include a specific definition of deliberation in our literature review that defines deliberation and deliberative processes as those that allow for open information exchange that are intended to push for a common good or a collective goal. which is distinct and different from negotiating or bargaining, where people might not change their mind. Essentially, in deliberation, minds need to be able to be changed for the common good. So to collect our data, we used a survey that we administered through Qualtrics. The total population was pretty small. There's about a little bit over 1,400 formal voting members across these RTOs. And because the population was small, we opted for purposeful sampling instead of random sampling. We wanted to hear from these people. We wanted to gauge their specific perspectives. And so we just wanted to reach out to and question as many of them as possible, again, since the population itself is pretty small. And since these are public entities, we were able to get 970 of the 1,400 contacts and have the survey sent to them in two different deliveries, once in August of 2020 and once in March of 2021. And the survey focused on process adaptability, public benefit questions, those opportunities for dialogue and learning, which are really important to that definition of deliberation, COVID, and alignment with those FERC principles I had outlined. We only got 137 responses, which at first we were a little bit concerned about, but some other recent research from partner teammates, I guess, coming out of Penn State, found that there is a difference between just being a member and being an active member. And one example of that is that the PJM interconnection, one of our partner researchers found that nearly 300 formal members hadn't actually cast votes towards initiatives between 2010 and 2019, which kind of goes to show that if not all formal members are participating in the actual RTOs themselves, it's understandable why the survey results weren't quite as high as we were hoping for. And this slide just goes to show the coverage. I wanted to break it down between RTO specifically and then different sectors of what stakeholders could be representing, just to show that we did have a pretty decent spread of where our data was coming from. Unfortunately, we didn't get much from New York ISO, but other than that, we felt that the coverage was pretty good. So moving into findings, thank you. Moving into findings, we found some pretty interesting data. First and foremost, from the stakeholders that we were able to survey, we found that RTOs are, as a whole, important venues for influencing energy policy. This graph here is a representation of a question where we asked respondents to indicate which of these 6 venues they go to try to influence energy policy. And as we can see, RTOs were the second most frequently listed venue, nearly tying that of state regulatory bodies. So we know that these stakeholders are using RTOs to try to make an influence. Next, we asked a similar question of indicating venues, but within specifically just RTOs. So we wanted to ask where within the structure of RTOs these stakeholders are spending time. And we had an interesting finding. I myself thought that the RTO boards and state PUC would be, or State Public Utilities Commission would be much more highly indicated, but we found that these lower groups, the subcommittees and task forces, are really highly utilized for trying to influence market rules, which again, I thought was different. It was different from what I was expecting. Another important finding is that, again, with this process of deliberation, we find that adaptability and the open exchange of information are important foundations for deliberation, which more or less the respondents indicated are happening within the RTO, but we had mixed perceptions on, again, if that mind-changing common good deliberation was actually happening. So these 2 bars on the right basically demonstrate that over 60% of respondents feel that the RTOs are appropriately supporting correct investments and adaptability and modifications for these transmission planning processes, for policy implementation, for facing challenges and opportunities. And then these bars on the right show that 3/4 roughly of the respondents feel that the promotion of information exchange and opportunity to represent opinions is happening within the RTOs. However, when we asked if the respondents are actually changing their minds about their goals through these stakeholder processes, 87% indicated that that's only happening sometimes, which shows that true deliberation as we defined it isn't always happening in these processes. And then my final finding slide, I am wrapping it up. Again, we found that these RTOs might not always be operating for the benefit of the public. When asked about operating for public benefit, 48% indicated that this is only happening sometimes or this is never happening. And when given the opportunity through a text box question to elaborate on that, we found some pretty strong themes indicating that there's a lack of the actual independent authority, and instead there's a prioritization of transmission and generation opinions by the RTO board that outweigh how heavily other opinions from non-market stakeholders are being prioritized. And we also found that it seems as though there's limited transparency. And then our final finding is that about 1/3 of the respondents have also indicated that the adjustments made to practices to combat COVID-19 has impacted their ability to effectively participate in these decision-making processes. So for concluding thoughts, we know that RTOs are important and the decisions that they're making are important on a national scale and local scales. And within RTOs, these lower committees and working groups are more important than we had originally thought in terms of influencing market rules and energy policy. And finally, despite adaptability and an open flow of information, this common good definition of deliberation may not always be happening. Some limitations of this work was that, again, we're very aware that we had less than a 10% coverage of population. And we think that that can be explained through this active versus non-active member. However, that's a really new finding as well. So there's no definite or concrete definition of what it means to be an active member versus a non-active member within an RTO. And then finally, we were hoping to get some statistically significant findings on whether or not the RTOs are in alignment with those 4 FERC principles I outlined at the beginning of my presentation, but we didn't receive enough responses for anything to be statistically significant. And then finally, some areas for future research, I feel would be a much heavier dive into this public benefit and RTO operation question, because again, they are supposed to be operating for the public benefit. And if half of our respondents think that that's not the case, that is something that's interesting and important that we understand more deeply moving forward. And then also, because of the lack of statistical significance, more work on this RTO alignment with those FERC principles. And that's all that I have for you guys. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.